while waiting, I will introduce myself. My name is Chloe Lum. I work doing programming for Volume Montreal. And this is the second of our online speaker series that we're doing this year. And you can find out about the other events, both online and in real life, on our website and social media pages. And I will just give it another minute. All right, well, we're going to start now, I think, and, people can come in as they come in. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that Volume Montreal is based on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation are recognized as the traditional custodians of the lands that we operate from. Shoshone, Montreal, is historically recognized as a gathering place of many First Nations. Today, it is the home to a diverse group of Indigenous people and settlers. So our guest of honor this evening is Ken Lum, and I'm super happy that he agreed to speak for us. I'm a huge fan. Originally from Vancouver, Ken Lum is known for his conceptual and representational art in a number of media, including painting, sculpture, and photography. He is currently the Marilyn J. Taylor Presidential Professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Stuart Weitzman School of Design in Philadelphia. He has exhibited widely, including the Sao Paolo Bienale, Shanghai Biennale, Documenta, the Whitney Biennale. And his book, Everything is Relevant, Writings on Art and Life, 1991 to 2018, was published last year by Concordia University Press. So Ken is going to be reading some texts from his book, and after his reading, he is going to be joined in conversation by Montreal artist Milutin Gubash, and then we will take a few questions from the audience. I would like to direct people, if they have questions, to please use the Q&A box on the right side of your Zoom, and we will go through them at the end of the conversation. All right, I'll give it to Ken.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Very glad to do this, and bonsoir tout le monde. Je suis très heureux d'être ici virtuel à Montréal. Okay, and later on, if someone has a question in French, I can try to, j'ai tenté à répondre suffisamment. Okay, so my French is a bit rusty, but I think I'm okay. So I started thinking about what I should read for the next 25 minutes and from my book, and I realized I actually have a text, which was several texts which are not from my book because they were too late to be included in the book. They were on floppy disks, and one was a keynote speech, but it just occurred to me I should have picked one of those texts because it would not have been one that anybody read. But given that, I thought selections from my book, why not start with the preface? So I'm going to start with the preface, and then it will unfold chronologically, and obviously some of the shorter text would work better, I think, as well, given the format. So I've always wanted to be an artist for as long as I can recall, even though the world of art museums was something I would discover only in adulthood. As a child, I enjoyed drawing and creating make-believe scenes. My model was the comic book, especially of the superhero variety. And to this day, my drawings are inspired by this style. I was often unwell as a child, and drawing was a source of comfort while being cared for by my grandparents at home. Sometimes my grandfather would return from nearby Chinatown with sheets of blank newspaper or newsprint used to wrap meat for me to draw on. Occasionally, I would get into trouble for drawing rather than doing Chinese homework. My mother had been a school teacher in China and wanted my brother and me to know Chinese. Throughout her life, she never knew more than a few English words. I felt a lot of expectations as a young child. There were also a lot of disruptions. We were evicted twice and had to move suddenly but we always stayed within the same small area of Strathcona in Vancouver, a heavily multi-ethnic and working class neighborhood just east of Chinatown. Making the rent was always a big worry. My family relied on me to translate instructions on packaging in spite of the fact that I could barely read, having entered directly into the first grade with nary a word of English. I did not do well in school initially and nearly failed grade 1. If not for a kindly teacher who argued on my behalf with my homeroom teacher, I would not have been allowed to continue on to grade 2. I did not fully understand what was going on, but I remember being quite scared about my family's reaction to me being failed. When I turned 8, my family moved to a house further east. The move felt like a new beginning. One of our neighbors was Pearl Gould. She was a cousin of the Canadian pianist Glenn Gould. She was a retired school teacher, and her husband Jack was a retired longshoreman. My mother worked in a factory until very late most days, so Pearl offered to take in my brother and me after we walked home from school. She would feed us Lipton soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. I still recall being in awe after my first taste of cream of mushroom soup. In addition to feeding us, Pearl would teach us a variety of subjects, including English, history, and mathematics. Under her tutelage, I felt as though I was learning the ropes of the dominant world. After nearly a year of Pearl's after-school lessons, my final 2 quarters of grades went from C's to A's. I remember how eager I was to run from school to Pearl's home to show her my grades. My brother's grades improved markedly as well. She gave us both long hugs. In high school, I was asked to design the yearbook covers and banners for events such as Gladiator Days. I took art class from grades 8 to 9, but stopped when the art teacher admonished me for making what he called weird images. He strongly urged me to follow the example of another student who was creating inexpressive and tame images. I found his advice confusing because he was the first art teacher to introduce me to the world of contemporary art, namely pop art, and I was grateful to him for that. I remember being excited by the giant objects of Klaus Oldenburg and the enlarged comic book style paintings of Roy Lichtenstein. Yet my teacher had very strong ideas about what art was and would criticize me harshly for not following his instructions to the letter. One of his assignments was to make a watercolor painting in the style of Lichtenstein. He taught us how to enlarge a comic book cell by penciling a grid on a larger sheet of paper. While others in the class started their Lichtenstein-inspired painting from actual comic books, I chose instead to work from a traumatic photograph in the Vancouver Sun newspaper and convert it into a comic book style. The photograph showed a car bombing victim in shredded clothing standing next to what remained of a car. My teacher thought this was a completely inappropriate image for artistic treatment. He told me not to take grade 10 art, which was at the time an elective course that required his approval. As much as I wanted to continue taking art, I had no choice but to accede to the art teacher's opinion. I was sorely disappointed. In hindsight, I can see how my disallowance was based on the art teacher's sense that I had to be put in my place, punishment for my implicit belief, something that I could even sense as a student, that the power of art lies in its disruptive potential. A school counselor had me take an aptitude test to determine which elective to take, and then suggested, based on the test results, that I take woodworking. I felt lost and a little frightened that an expert in career counseling would recommend woodworking as a viable future path for me. I had already sampled woodworking in grade 8 and was terrible at it. True to form, my year in the carpentry shop proved disastrous. The wood shop instructor kindly helped me finish every project. He advised me to take an extra science course since I did reasonably well in biology and chemistry. I decided to do just that and completed high school without any illusions of art, as I inchoately defined it then, being part of my life. Next came university and a course load comprising mainly of classes in mathematics and science. By my second year, a day did not go by in which I did not don a white lab coat and attach a Texas Instruments calculator to the belt of my pants. I did decently enough in all my courses, but I had to really work at it. I struggled in all of my science courses to do reasonably well, while my colleagues seemed to just breeze through chemistry equations. In my third year, I felt increasingly depressed. I never sought help for my feelings, but I could not sleep, and I would experience frequent breakdowns. It was not uncommon for me to while away my nights driving around the city or sitting in a 24-hour Denny's restaurant until the sun came up. My grade point average plummeted, and I barely passed several courses. One of my chemistry professors called me to his office after I flunked a fairly easy exam. He understood why I might have not done well on several problems on the test, but he noticed that I was failing even the early steps of algebra, which he knew I had already mastered. He told me that he could not in good conscience fail me because he believed I was better than the score showed. I ended up with 1 grade above pass. That summer, after the completion of my third year of undergraduate study, I landed a job as a lab assistant in a research station of the British Columbia Ministry of Agriculture. Once again, I spent my days in a white lab coat with a calculator on my belt and a baseball cap emblazoned with a logo of an insecticide company. During this time, I also got a part-time job designing announcement posters for the Vancouver Public Library. And I worked on occasion under the guidance of a former neighbor who was a sign painter. I like to keep busy, if only to avoid falling back into a funk. I especially enjoyed the assignments from the library to design posters for events such as children's puppet shows. I enjoyed too the moment when jobs came in to make large paper banners announcing things such as the Monarch Furniture semi-annual sale. I was happy to find what felt to be a good balance between my activities at the agricultural research station and my artistic work. I just did not think anything outside of a life in a laboratory was possible for me. The pay and benefits provided a sense of security. I knew my weaknesses in science, but I also knew my strengths. I was able to think unconventionally. One biological control experiment devised by my lab superior went exceptionally well. As a result, my picture graced the cover of the British Columbia news section of the Vancouver Sun, the city's largest daily broadsheet. With the lab where I worked as backdrop, I held in my hands a pile of dead fly pupae, which I was asked by the Sun photographer to gaze downward at. At some point afterward, my boss, Dr. Costello, took me aside and said to me that if I continued to work hard and study toward a PhD, the lab he headed could be mine in about 10 years. Rather than feel reassured by Dr. Costello's message of encouragement, I felt an immediate sense of confusion and fear about what I really wanted to do. I was deeply afraid of the idea of spending my life working in a laboratory. I found life there isolating. I felt something missing in the rest of my life as well. I wanted to experience more of the world. It was clear to me that a drastic change of course was needed. In my junior year, I enrolled in an evening art class offered by Simon Fraser University. I was curious about what such a class would entail. I suspected that I might enjoy it. The professors and students I met in art were completely different from what I was used to. Many of the students were older and possessed a lot of firsthand knowledge about many aspects of the world. There was a notable fluidity in terms of what was appropriate and inappropriate conversation in class. I felt an incredible excitement, but I also felt deeply anxious about disappointing my professors in science, especially the one who was counting on me to pursue graduate study under him. By my final year as an undergraduate, I could not read enough about art. I could not read enough about everything else too, because it seemed to me that artistic knowledge touched on many other bodies of knowledge. I would spend my evenings in the university library reading as many books about art as I could. I volunteered to write art reviews for the student newspaper. I soon discovered that the Vancouver Art Gallery had a library with limited public hours, and I would plant myself at a table there as often as possible. At the time in the city, there were very few of any venues that showed the latest contemporary art. So it was through absorbing the latest art forum and the like that I kept informed about developments in art, which I was still trying to make a map of in my head. The Vancouver Art Gallery Library was also where I met the remarkable Mariana Schmidt. She was an artist who was well into her 70s. She passed away in 2005. Together, we would pore over the latest art magazines and catalogs that came into the library. We had amazing conversations. I discovered that she was a retired hospital lab technician. Sorry, if you can hear my dog barking, who had decided to pursue art later in life. She told me that she had always wanted to be an artist, but circumstances did not allow for it until her retirement. I identified with her. She told me that I had no choice but to make the full leap into art. She noticed that the art world was starting to be much more open to artists of color like me. She told me her life story. She had lost her entire family to war and lived in European refugee camps for many years before finally being able to immigrate to Vancouver. She claimed that her imagination and love of making art sustained her in the most difficult times of her life. She told me that she saw a bit of herself in me. I cannot adequately convey how touched I was to hear this. I felt compelled to immerse myself more fully into art. It was at this time that I started to write as a way of putting my thoughts into words. I kept multiple notebooks and pens on hand to make notes, which would often end up looking like a Joseph Beuys blackboard drawing. Writing helped me map out what I was learning. At that time, there was a prominent way of thinking in the art world about the indispensable function of text as a disruptor of aesthetic pleasure. Text was considered political and real, while representational systems were deemed distorting and suspect. Text, it was assumed, challenged the foundations of representation, foundations that generate so much of the world's coherence. For politically engaged artists, the presence of text in work of art signaled a refusal to submit to the pleasure principle of art. It was a way to move toward political agency. My image text works owe something to this belief, as this was the climate in which I emerged as an artist. But I was never entirely comfortable with this view. I learned from my sign painting days that text, especially in its graphic form, is imbued with its own aesthetic capacity. I'm interested in the pictorial qualities of text as much as I am in the textuality of pictures. In my work, I use text not to negate images, even though I recognize that the presence of one component can destabilize the other. Instead, I see text as having the power to complicate the aesthetic experience. The practice of writing has provided me with a kind of reprieve from the tendency to turn inward. I have sought out projects that have brought me to West Africa, the Middle East, and the Far East, and then written about my experiences as a way to reinvigorate my love of art and the self. I hope the writings in this book offer the reading some sense of what I mean. The next text I'm going to read is called On Board the Raft of Medusa, and it was presented at Yale University's Department of Art History and Caribbean Studies, 2 departments. Towards the center, a rising, mounting movement begins. Here some of the shipwrecked, among them an Arab, have awakened from their apathy and with lifted hands push excitedly towards the horizon where the rescue ship appears. Then the single scream of the composition broadens out towards the sides, like the short arms of the Latin cross, though all the movement still points forward. And the central axis moves straight on its triumphant summit, the slim nude back of the Negro, mounted on a barrel and supported by his comrades, waving a white cloth into the air. He is the final peak of a pyramid of moving, excited bodies. Walter Friedlander's description of the composition of Theodore Géricault's famous painting, The Raft of the Medusa, is rendered in a manner that suggests a kind of longing filled with sexual license. His notation of an Arab, a Moor to be precise, and a Black African is remarkably axiomatic, the racial difference subsumed within the relative benignness of descriptive analysis. Friedlander recognizes this assumption of a pattern of erotic containment until the eye is directed to the painting's eruptive point, the handsome back of a young Black man. In Géricault's painting, everyone is literally on the same boat, with hardly a shred of clothing to distinguish officer from seaman and slave from slave trader. Although the depicted scene is a tragic one, the grouping of bodies on the raft can be read unitarily as a community. The raft functions as a platform of interspersed sexual and racial codes, metonymically split from the false decorousness and rigidly stratified constitution of French society of the period. More particularly, the composition of the human pyramid aboard the raft is meant to mirror the social composition of France's apparatus of empire, built to a large extent as it was on the backs of male African slaves. Despite its apparent form as history painting, the viewing public for the Raft Medusa at the Salon of 1819 understood in great detail that the painting was essentially social commentary. The source material for Géricault's great work was a widely disseminated book jointly authored by Alexandre Correal and B. Henri Sévigny, the surgeon on the Medusa. Based on eyewitness accounts of the 1816 disaster, the book, which was first published in 1817, transformed this particular tragedy at sea, a then common occurrence, into a nationwide scandale célèbre that challenged the return to rule of the Bourbon monarchy. The Salon public was familiar with the events surrounding the Medusa, as outlined in the book. They knew that the ship had foundered at sea off the Atlantic coast of Africa, in part because of the incompetence of an inexperienced captain, undeserving of his position, but for his aristocratic birth. They knew that the Medusa was but a single link in their nation's extensive slave operations, within which Arab Moors and French were instrumental in brokering new supplies of slaves. They would have discerned no irony in seeing Blacks represented aboard a frigate departed from France and headed for Senegal's Cap Vert, the infamous peninsula from which millions of slaves embarked for the Americas. The presence of the African had by Géricault's time become a not uncommon sight in France, as the process of colonization increasingly affected, however unintentionally, a closer proximity of the races. The resonance in Géricault's masterpiece owes considerably to its performance as a liminal picture. The image is of a moment between the aftermath of a disaster wrought by scandalous social conditions and the impending return to the same social conditions. The depicted scene is situated within an interregnum of deculturation, far from the insistent and invariant structure of the then current world of European society. The hierarchy of differences that was inscribed prior to departure from Rochefort, France, also existed, of course, aboard the frigate in terms of the segregated sleeping quarters and the quality and allotment of food that was given according to the varying degrees of birthright, status, and rank. This social classification was enforced right up until the moment of the shipwreck. The published narratives on the tragedy all charge there were insufficient lifeboats aboard. A state official, a new governor of Senegal, his wife and two daughters took two of the lifeboats, one for themselves and another for their trunks. As noted by Marine Ryan, those left on the raft, about 150, were mostly workers and lower rank officers. Their weapons had been removed from them amid mutinous episodes against the bourgeois passengers and officers. There were a few higher ranked officers, including the original co-authors of the shipwreck narrative, the engineer Couriard and the ship's surgeon Savigny, who insisted on going on the raft with the work crew. But it is important to note here that Upon being rescued and in a Senegal hospital, Corillard complained bitterly that he as a gentleman was given the same treatment and food as were given his enlisted or lower ranked colleagues. The Medusa painting is an image that upsets power relations because it articulated modern ideas of multiple social roles, but it could only do so on the largely imaginary and deculturated setting of Géricault's canvas. The drama at sea in faraway African waters and on a primitive platform provided the artist with a tabula rasa for his ideas of transforming racial and sexual consciousness, ideas that Géricault recognized would be difficult to express, except as a conjunction of communion and crisis. It is well documented by Anglaise de Praviel, the royalist who submitted a conservative account of the events on the Medusa, that difference did exist aboard the raft, despite the ensuing chaos. The point is constituting a political transgression in art, a risk Géricault understood to exist in his Medusa work. In a feeble move to mitigate the political efficacy of his monumental work, Géricault entered his painting into the salon with the simple title Le Naufrage, or the shipwreck, without reference at all to the narrative whence it derived. The knowledge that the salon public possessed about the Medusa narrative shaped their expectations about Le Naufrage, which would later be renamed with its present title. Conversely, Géricault understood as well the common terrain on which he and the public could meet. The important artistic problem for Géricault was how to negotiate a meeting of mutuality without ceding his art to mere illustration of historical fact. His solution was to highlight the salience of race and male sexuality in the Raft narrative by dislodging both terms from their normative and socially fixed meanings. Throughout his career, Géricault insisted on the prominence of both discursive terms in the configuration of modernity. The rationalization of a full realization of human freedom for slaves was consistently compromised by the faith invested in the guidance provided by positivistic thought and the empirical sciences that in Géricault's time made many racist claims on the person of the slave. A common view among Europeans held that the Black body was a savage body descended from a tribe of cannibals. Homologies between racist science and the slave trade were widely accepted because the equation of Blacks with cannibalism, for example, offered the convenience of one more racial justification for slavery. Both Géricault and the Salon public were familiar with the accounts of cannibalism that had taken place on the raft, measures taken out of desperation to survive. But in the artist's Medusa painting, cannibalism is not essentialized as a property intrinsic to the Black person. Rather, it is something generalized to both the white body and the Black body. The artist seems to be saying that in a disease situation, anyone can become a cannibal. Set against French contemporary ethos of the period, the Raft operates as a notational model in which social identities are damaged and less than whole for want of a non-repressed accommodation of sexual and racial differences within culture. In this context, it is interesting to cite the many paintings and lithographs Géricault produced involving injured soldiers, one-legged men, and disembodied human parts. Equally significant are his many eloquent images of Black men, often depicted in equal terms to white men, of which lithographs such as the Maréchal Ferrand Anglais and Boxeur are good examples. Tête de Négresse and Tête de Noir are portraitures full of compassion and almost shocking in their straightforward treatment of persons who could have been considered as less than full citizens in a racially and status-conscious Bourbon society. For Géricault, the repressed modes of race and sex represented the structuring principle for becoming undamaged and for the possible emergence of a new and wholesome subjectivity. The Raft and Medusa did not conform neatly to contemporary perceptions about alterity. What it more accurately conformed to were contemporary facts about alterity not yet understood. The discourse of colonization meant the increasing inscription of the other within the space of the same. Géricault's Medusa functioned as a signpost of multiracial hybridity, one that affected what Homi Bhabha has described as the unfixing of the authority of colonial discourse by the voice of the other. As such, the Raft Medusa operates in what Bell Hooks refers to as a counter-hegemonic cultural production. The painting is an expression of Géricault's reflection on the profound precariousness of traditional conceptions of race and sexuality at the dawn of the modern industrial age. He understood that to think historically about slavery was to grapple with a profound ambiguity, that slavery continued to thrive in a period marked by profound opposition. This led Géricault to draw upon the subconscious force of the image of the Black African in order to challenge its basis. His challenge came at a time when debates about the slave trade coincided with what Heinrich Heine has called the new revolutionary force of money. Norbert Elias has pointed out that the reproduction of capital is tied to the reproduction of slaves, and thus directly or indirectly to the success of military campaigns. It has been argued that international finance entered into the modern era after the French debacle at Waterloo in 1815, merely a year before the Medusa tragedy, when there was a decisive shift in influence from nation states to financial institutions, such as the House of Rothschild and Baring Brothers. The penetration of European money into Africa, Asia, and the Americas spurred new entrepreneurial agencies of European colonialism that established a global division of labor of unprecedented exploitative power. Despite its language of indignity, opposition to slavery was often in practice an argument for a new form of indentured labor. The work of slaves would be recast, excuse me, in new terms as agricultural laborers, legally and economically bonded to France, free only to the extent of the slave wages offered. In an environment of such moral ambiguity, most art historical treatments of the Raft Medusa concentrated on the allegorical functioning of the painting, its image of despair and degeneracy is interpreted as Géricault's criticism of the social body. The sub-theme of slavery is read dually as either an expression of liberal sentiment against the enslavement of the bourgeoisie by the aristocratic values of the restored Bourbon order, or as a caution against enslavement by the emerging factory economy. In fact, there has been surprisingly little analysis in terms of the painting's other functioning as a radical expression of racial and sexual permutability within modernity. Indeed, Géricault's rendering of the human pyramid aboard the raft as an inter-affiliated mass of ad udum identities prompted many contemporary critics to describe the painting as illegible. The artist was faulted for not abiding by the conventional exigencies of history painting, and especially for failing to meet the demand of literal lucidity. Rather than following the classical law of an overall planarity of precisely distributed objects and figures, Géricault offered an interlocked structure of interchangeable and multiple identities. As a result, public and critic alike were often confused by what they saw. At the 1819 Salon, there was barely a mention, if at all, of the Black figure at the all-important apex of the Raft human triangle. Aside from social art, historical, and psychoanalytical treatments, there has been very little in the way of post-structural analysis of the discourse of multiple racial and masculine sexual identities, a discourse that resonates so abundantly within the Medusa painting. The Black body is often allegorized in art as an object of desire. According to Frantz Fanon, this is so because as the other of whiteness, the Black body has been culturally and historically constructed as a phobic object, sexually and morally deviant from the white. In his Medusa painting, Géricault problematized contemporary views of the Black person, but not only inverting his actual social position to that of the potentially heroic position of savior, but also by amalgamating him into a multiracial organic paradigm. As many have noted, where the published story of the shipwreck disaster noted one Black African on the raft, Géricault multiplies his number to 3 in history painting. Géricault may have increased the number of Africans to further consolidate their pictorial presence as an integrational gesture. By doing so, he ensured that no single person, including the young Black man at the top of the pyramid, could be construed as exceptional to the projection of the whole. What was important to Géricault was the idea that difference and individuation do not threaten the whole, but may even advance it. By recognizing the ramifications of this in his now famous painting, Géricault also understood well the attendant risks involved. And then this next one is quite short. It's a review I wrote of Dakar, and I was in Dakar, Senegal, to take in Dakar 1998. There are no necessary links between the cosmopolitanism of Western art discourse and the practical participation of non-Western art epistemologies. This is not because the worldly aspirations of Western art discourse represents little more than empty rhetoric, but because its language was never meant to be aimed beyond the imagination of the Western ego. Many have criticized modern art's primitivist impulses and the appropriation of African objects and motifs by artists such as Picasso, and rightly so. Yet these tendencies can also be understood as logical and inevitable within the egocentric development of Western art's self-conception. In Claude Lévi-Strauss's The Structural Study of Myth from 1955, Clothian beings emanating from the netherworld beneath the terra, that is, creatures from the earth, are monsters that have to be destroyed because of their differences from Western cosmology. In Lévi-Strauss's reading of Oedipus, these creatures are a metonymy for the violence of Western discourse toward all other discourses that refuse to deny humanity's earthly origins. Over and over again, the development of Western art is predicated on claiming non-Western art forms for itself. Perhaps this has changed somewhat as anxieties in the West about the virtue of its own thought no longer produces only indifference or something worse to the welfare of the other, but also produces the recognition of greater cultural interdependence. Still, a visit to Dakar, Senegal on the occasion of Dakar, one of the only 2 biennales of contemporary art in Africa, and the largest and most important, is a reminder of the multiplicity of modernities in the world, not just a singular one. In this instance, it is a modernity that expresses the continuing struggle that breaks free from Senegal's neo-colonial relationship with France. Taking in Dakar underlined, to my mind at least, the utterly oppressive role that the West continues to play in much of the non-Western world today. Dakar was officially opened by the Senegalese president, Abdou Diouf, in a theater that has seen a lot of wear and tear since the halcyon days of the Festival Mondial des Arts Nègres of 1966, for which it was built. Rather than Duke Ellington, James Baldwin, Aimé Césaire, Josephine Baker, and other luminaries from the world's African diaspora, Dakar's opening ceremonies included an audience of officials from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, UNESCO, various curators of African art, mostly from America, and the men and women who make up Senegal's international ambassadorial corporates. Other than notable exceptions like the curator from London's excellent Institute of Contemporary Art and the independent American curator, Mary Jane Jacob, there were very few of the Western art world personages one would encounter at the opening events such as Documenta or the Venice Biennale. This would not necessarily be a bad thing, as the world is in dire need of alternative models for not only art, but art systems. But Dakar's political influence is remote, weak, and a highly contained one. What was on view consisted almost entirely of paintings, invariably scaled for the easel. To be fair, this is in large part a reflection of the real economy, very poor, politically unstable, in which West African artists must work. Mere canvas and paints are expensive, never mind the luxury of computers and video equipment for elaborate video art installations. A look at the contents of the paintings, however, was another matter. There was very little in the way of political content, at least in the manner in which it was familiar in the West. Ironically, at least to me, the most politically engaging art to be found at Dakar was by diasporic artists such as Carrie Mae Weems. Also interesting were artists from South Africa like Willie Bester, for whom an entirely different set of circumstances affects their work. Paintings tended to be historical homages to the L'École de Dakar, the post-World War II art movement that was brought up in conversation by many of the artists with whom I spoke. Dialogues about art were generally closeted to the single French art movement, which corresponded, not coincidentally, with the completion of West Africa's decolonization process. The École de Dakar, a group of painters who exhibited in the 1966 festival, is now regarded as Senegal's most important declaration of artistic autonomy. That this école was never really an école, but named as such by André Malraux as he toured the festival, is just one more irony that one encounters in Dakar. Perhaps I'm showing my chauvinism in demanding of the art that I saw a political concern that could not possibly be there in the way that I would recognize. I was told by an artist from Togo that I would have to fully discard all of my Western conceptions about art in order to begin the process of understanding his work. Only then would I start to see the political vitality of his paintings, which were by and large abstract to my eyes. Another artist mentioned to me that the conflation of art and life is a reality in Africa, not some theoretical carrot, as it is often considered in the West. Perhaps they were right. The reality I experienced at Dakar art was a biennale that seemed rather purposeless, aside from dredging up the utopian ghosts of 1966. Yet for all my criticism, which undoubtedly must reveal my prejudices, I did come away from Senegal with a deeper understanding of art, something which I seldom experienced in the world of Chelsea, New York galleries. I departed Leopold Sédar Senghor International Airport thinking about Dakar's potential as a politically and culturally significant voice in a world where the presence of contemporary art is becoming more pervasive. The potential is overwhelmingly there, but the question of whether it can be ever realized is another matter entirely. And I'll just read maybe one more, and I had three more, but I'll just read one more because I think I really have my limit of reading as well. So this is a short piece I wrote for Canadian Art when I used to write every quarterly online for Canadian Art. And it's called Living in America. Earlier this summer, I co-curated a large public art and urban research project titled Monument Lab, Creative Speculations for Philadelphia. The month-long project took place in the courtyard of Philadelphia's iconic City Hall, where members of the public were invited to propose speculative monuments that they felt were needed at this point in time in the city. I encountered many Philadelphians who passionately described traumatic events that have marked the city, yet are hardly ever spoken about in more official channels. I met an elderly African-American man who was unable to read or write, but remembered in remarkable detail the move bombing that occurred in West Philadelphia 30 years ago. Monument Lab showed me that it is possible to inaugurate many things in America, including an ambitious and even potentially contentious project that took up a good part of the public courtyard of City Hall. Yet the project also revealed how utterly impossible life is for so many here in America. It is the impossibility of life and the impossibility to speak the unspeakable that is the central dialectic of American art. This is not to say that artists here are not tackling meaningful societal concerns. They are. But the laws of the American way of life are deeply entrenched. To wit, this year I discovered that I no longer had a right to vote in the Canadian federal election, a development that is shocking to me. I believe such a confiscation of a basic right could not happen so blithely in the United States. Despite this entrenchment, there is still space, albeit small, within contemporary art for the expression of views that challenge sacrosanct beliefs. I would argue that it is the opposite case in Canada, where the idea of art as social critique is more pronounced, in part because it is what is expected of art. I feel that this is true also for Canadian non-objective painting, which cannot exist without a critical discourse of its right to be. At the risk of extracting essences from a complex situation, contemporary art in America is allowed, or rather expected, to exist without qualifiers or provisions. A work of art can just be. Of course, this has been a point of contention in American art since abstract expressionism. Contemporary art in America exists as in a Western movie landscape, empty, lawless, simultaneously ahistorical and transhistorical, a repository for unanchored expressions and anxieties. After 3 years in Philadelphia, I have come to the realization I may have left Canada, but Canada has never left me. I am not referring entirely to affection, but also to some degree of disaffection in terms of certain memories that distress me. I make about 3 or 4 trips to Canada a year, and the success of my home country increasingly reveals itself to me as my residency in the United States becomes more and more ensconced. Living in America is a Faustian pact in that it is hard to go back, not because it is so much better than Canada, it is not, but for the mundane reason that the tax system is structured in a way that discourages revocation. It is a cliche to say that one can come to understand a place better from afar. I feel a deepening appreciation for Canada the longer I'm here. Political debate is far less Manichean than here in the United States. There is belief in the state as a corrective force against excesses of human behavior or the marketplace that could threaten the general welfare of the society. Despite the attributes of Canadian society, I do not regret moving to the United States. It would have been all too easy to remain in Vancouver, but relocating to Philadelphia has allowed me to follow a course of greater self-experimentation. My thinking about art and life comes largely out of growing up in a quiet but skittish Vancouver, which has since transmogrified into something I barely recognize as my own. An immense influx of capital has transformed the city into a spectacle that engenders in its visitors feelings akin to the discovery of poetry, unaware that it is misrecognition of depths for surfaces. Vancouver has become adorned in what Walter Benjamin called dream kitsch, the last mask of the banal, the one with which we adorn ourselves in dream and conversation, so as to take in the energies of an outlived world of things. It is not just things that become outlived, but the people for whom the city is no longer a possibility. In 2014, I was invited to take part in the Whitney Biennial. During the opening, I ran into another Canadian artist whose work was also included in the exhibition. Over the course of our brief conversation, he lamented that, try as he did to look at Canada, where he had lived and worked, Canada never looked back. Our conversation sparked a rather stinging memory of a studio visit that I had with a curator from a major Canadian museum when I was only at the start of my path as an artist. After looking over my work, the curator admonished me for making images that did not look very Canadian. It was my portrait logo works that she seemed most bothered by. These diptychs were comprised of a commercial studio photograph portrait on one side and the abstract corporate symbol logo constructed from colored plexiglass on the other. The curator described the works as cold. It was not the coldness, whatever that meant, that was most objectionable to the curator. However, but rather the lack of concern for hopeful agencies that could provide the viewer with an outlet from the alienating spirit that she felt the work engendered. This surprised me, as I had always thought my work to be an expression of my East Vancouver roots. In Canada, there was and continues to be a certain ideal of what can constitute Canadian culture. Entities such as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation continue to advance the narrative of Canada as a culturally fragile place, with stories of success beyond the borders of Canada promoted as somehow rare. The narrative of a nation comprised of isolated communities under constant threat from the forces of nature endures, in spite of how much it is awkwardly negotiated with the reality of Canada's increasingly cosmopolitan urban centers. The reality of vibrant multi-ethnic urban clusters is folded into the former meta-narrative of the bush. But both narratives, like all narratives, are built on misrepresentations. While it is true that Canada possesses striking natural landscapes, the country is also home to Arctic oil and mining exploration, massive tar sands development, neighborhoods of the disenfranchised and ravaged First Nations and Aboriginal communities that continue to be maltreated by a highly paternalistic state. In the United States, the narrative of an untouched nature has all but disappeared. No one really believes it anymore, except for perhaps the very wealthy who can buy the acreage to fulfill such fantasies. The notion of the citizen has been replaced by the term taxpayer, and politics no longer even pretend to be about anything but disagreements between elites. Contemporary art has followed suit. It is not just the hedge fund managers or real estate moguls that comprise a significant number of contemporary art collectors, which they do, but that their worldviews extend into the question of what art is. Yet I still believe in art, if only in the narrow sense of what art has done for me in my own life. It is through art that I am constantly challenged to understand the world and my place within it, even if that place is one that I'm not entirely at home in. Okay, thanks very much.
I think this is where I jump in.
Yeah. I've never done a reading before, so
it's wonderful. Some of those essays and articles I've now read maybe 2, 3 or more times, having encountered them somewhere else in their original published form. So one of the things that I thought the best place maybe to start was with the title of the book, which I don't even know if we mentioned quite yet. And it is Everything is Relevant, Writings on Art and Life, 1991 to 2018. I'm not very good at math, but that tracks to about something over 25 years of thinking about art through writing and publishing. And Ken, my first question to you is wondering if there's a condensed way for you to describe how your thinking about art has changed between the time of this earliest publication and now.
A condensed way, okay.
Or not condensed way.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the title, Everything is Relevant, is just another way of saying that, you know, life, meaning in life is completely contingent, right? The idea that everything is contingent. My DNA is contingent on your DNA, right? We are like masses of 90% water in which, you know, molecules from around us are constantly flowing in through our porous bodies. And so that means we are part of everything. And, you know, and that's not just some Buddhic or, you know, Buddhist kind of way of thinking, but just a fact. And I think I like to look at the world in that sense. I would say that the overarching narrative in terms of what has propelled me in my practice as an artist, but also including my writing as an artist and including the curatorial projects, is my curiosity about the multi-dimensional aspects of art, and really trying my hand in trying to grapple with the breadth of art, the possibilities of art, because I believe in art, but but it's also ironically the disillusionments I've encountered of art's compromise within, you know, the art world, within the art system, within the system that is given over to the business of art, say, within the various biases that have historically been in place in terms of artists of difference and women artists and so on, that I want to explore. I want to know as much about art as possible. And so that's really the guiding principle. And which, when I found out that, you know, in the, you know, after China started opening up after 1979, and then I was really curious about it, partly because of Chinese, but I was really curious about it. And I tried over a number of years, by the mid 80s, to try to get to China, but I didn't want to just go there as a tourist. I wanted to go there with a project. And so, and then I met someone and I said, well, what about this early Republican period of China? This is the Republican period of 1919 to 1949, essentially, but and so on. So, and this guy I met was an expert in this area, and so I started reading up as much as possible in order to persuade him that I would make a good partner for such a project, because I'm not an expert in it, but I became an expert. So I worked hard at trying to create the conditions that would allow me to do in-depth, sustained stays in various countries, and I could write about it. And so that was really the guiding principle, just an insatiable curiosity about finding out as much as possible about art, but also about trying to learn something about myself and my place in the world as well.
Right. Yeah, it actually comes across somewhat in individual articles and essays, but overall, that one really can appreciate the sense that everything is connected and that everyone is somehow connected. And but detect, maybe since we're talking about the everything is relevant part of the title, that there's also a kind of like I tried to imagine when I was puzzling why that title, and it seemed to me that it wasn't just simply about like everything is interesting or everything is on the same level or of the same value, but that there could be like a kind of forensic or clinical kind of dimension to this, that you know, when you're studying something at a crime scene, everything is really relevant. And,
right.
You know,
well, I think I am a bit of a clinician in that sense, because my formation was, you know, I have an undergraduate science degree, right? And I worked a lot of years in labs, and I wrote not a lot, but I wrote a number of published co-authored scientific papers, and it was just a way of, I always looked at the world. But I also think the way I look at the world is maybe scientific from the point of view of someone who grew up quite poor, right? And you know, the son of an immigrant. And so in that situation, you learn how to you basically learn how to scan the entire field in order to try to find the shortest route to get ahead, right? So for some it's crime, right? But for me it was like, okay, I'm not criminally inclined, so what do I need to read? What do I need to do? What do I need to master in order to get ahead?
One of the other elements, like the three intersecting paths in the title for me, is the writings on art and life. It's the art and life part that I'm really interested in, and I think I even pulled a quote out from one of the articles where you say literally, art should be about life, like that plainly. Art should be about life. I'm really trying to be on my best behavior here. I think I'm probably very annoying and needly in life.
No, be rude. Be rude. Don't be at your best.
Are there shortcomings for you about how art engages with life that you can express?
No, of course, and that's why I've had all kinds of breakdowns, right? And now that when I got older, I learned how to handle those breakdowns, but a lot of disillusionment, of course, because there's a non-identity problem between the ideals that propelled me as an artist to go into art, that made me want to be making art, and the reality of how art proceeds and operates within the system of art, right? And but then at some point, I also realized that the way art operates within the system of art, which is lesser than the ideals of art, that in a way that should be the case, because it's like any social construction by human beings. So why should it be any different? Why should it be any more idealistic than any other discipline of knowledge, right? So that's a very kind of pessimistic view, but that's how I took it. And but then I tried to compensate by going to the margins, so to speak, of the then art world, at least the way I understood it. And why I went to West Africa, why I did a 2-year project in in Sharjah in the Middle East, and why I did I stopped making art for almost 3 years just to make this exhibition on the First Republic, the culture of the First Republic of China from 1919. So, my skepticism of the art system allowed me to be productive in the sense that I didn't feel like I needed to always worry about my status within the art world. And of course I paid certain penalties, like my New York galleries had asked me why I wasn't showing, and I told her I was working on this curatorial project. And, and then she said, well, you're not being a real artist, and she dropped me. So, but I felt like I was producing knowledge that was much more important. So, and that's very hard for artists to do. Not everyone can do it. I'm not trying to infer that I have, courage. It's not that. It's just, I just never really believed in art. So as much as a lot of my friends in New York who are constantly going to every opening with the hopes that they can catch that break and so on. So, and I have shows. I have a show coming up, and I have a solo museum show in Antwerp this summer, and I have a solo show coming up in New York in January. So, right, but I'm much happier doing things according to my own pace and rules.
These are just sort of the warm-up questions for me, maybe in a way, the throwaways. But is there something that you think art would more ideally do that it's not doing yet or cannot yet do?
Well, I think one of the great advantages of art, right, is, and maybe that advantage has been diminished in recent years because of the internet, because of all kinds of alternative, let's say, creative expressions that doesn't have to be designated or nominated as art in the first place. But that where, people are kind of expressing their impulses in ways that's not enfolded into the art system, right? They're just kind of enfolded, expressed, and then they are imparted and lodged in YouTube, for example, and so on. So, but I think one of the advantages of art traditionally has been that it's very difficult to fix it as a definition of what its purpose is. It could be silly, it could be stupid, it could be contradictory, it could be meaningless. All of it is possible, right? And I think that its openness is its saving grace. Its openness is also why so many other disciplines and epistemologies are trying to learn from art, right? A lot of social science, such as sociology, anthropology, archaeology, these are all, proven to be quite problematic in terms of the relationship to the colonial enterprise, for example, in terms of the kind of taking of all kinds of valuable objects from other territories during days of empire and so on, and so and art is an incredibly incredible unfixing tool in terms of unfixing entrenched values, entrenched thinking, entrenched normative values, and so on. So I think that's the great advantage of art. I still believe that's the one advantage that I hold on to for art.
You mentioned somewhere in one of the articles wanting to discover a true purpose for art. I don't know if this was in like a kind of artistic midlife crisis moment, or if it was in a moment where you were doubting perhaps your role in art or something like that. I mean, I think you've kind of touched on some of these things, but do you think that there can really be a true purpose to art?
No, I'm speaking about it speculatively as a kind of motivating category for me, right? But a true purpose, I don't believe in essences for one thing, although I believe essences can exist, but for a moment, right? So I do believe that there can be absolute moments, but they are highly relative too. So it's all very paradoxical. So I think a true purpose, I think to be an artist, at least my way of thinking, you have to be driven by some idea of a purpose for art. If there's no purpose for art, I don't think I would be an artist, even if it's a purpose that's totally imagined. I think it's essential to at least not believe in a kind of religious sense, but to think that, yeah, what is this purpose? What is it? It's almost like a holy grail, it's like authorian kind of quest. And so if I didn't have that purpose, or at least I didn't have that idea that there was a purpose, I wouldn't do art. I tried to do something else.
Right.
Right. And during moments where and I've had many moments of crisis where I actually come close to thinking there's no purpose to art. That's because I see, you know, let's say, in fact, that many of the hedge fund fathers and mothers I mentioned of the children I teach at Penn in Philadelphia, a very elite school, you know, tuition like almost 70,000 US a year, just to give you an idea. And many of the students I teach, right, many of the parents are like collectors, major collectors as well. So it's like I go, oh God, you know. So there's been moments in my life where I felt, you know, deep skepticism about art, right? So I try to do something else. Like during pandemic time, I wrote 2 screenplays, for example. I never wrote 2 before. They were historical dramas. So I try to create projects and so on to, in a way, to that go off from what I do as an artist, but they also extend my work as an artist in a funny way.
Do you feel when you look sort of more broadly at what is happening in art today, do you think that we may be in a kind of stasis, or conversely, do you think that we're in a moment of transition or transformation where we don't really know collectively or individually how to move forward? Like when I look around me, I see 2 kind of pronounced tendencies that stand out today. One is a kind of model of art as social activism, which is powerful and successful often, but as often as not is kind of flat and a bit anemic in the face of an actual social reality. Mm-hmm. And the other is this kind of tendency to cannibalize art of the very recent past, which I think stopped producing heat or light for me,
right,
a number of years ago.
Right. Well, the you know, it's like Goya's Saturn, right? It's like the eating your own son. Right. And it is a kind of cannibalism of art, because art is at a point of you know, of crisis in terms of, you know, all systems of representation is at a crisis point, right? We live in the age of like fake news and everything. There's no verity, there's no, and so on. But yet at the same time, that's also that's very dangerous to actually believe that, because there are truths that are worth holding on to. There are values that are more important than others. But I think there's another choice that you don't mention. You don't have to be you know, an engagé, as the French says, in terms of an artist, right? In terms of your work, you could be engagé as a human being, right? I mean, I participated in the BLM movements quite a lot here in Philadelphia. I co-started Monument Lab, right, which was started in 2012, and now it's become quite a big thing. And it was all about providing a kind of reasoning and language for thinking about, in a very critical way, problematic monuments, which has now become very de rigueur, right? And so on. So, you know, and that was a lot of work. It wasn't like it was simple. I had to, you know, it was like, you know, I would say 8 or 9 years of hard work to get Monument Lab to the point where, you know, now we're a quite well-known institution, and so on. So that's not my work as an artist, that's my work as a human being. But of course, the interests of my work as a human being are not entirely separate from my interests of what I want to talk about through art.
You talk about art in some of the essays collected in the volume as being something like an endeavor to find a sense of belonging for yourself. Would you elaborate a bit on how you see that? And I have a kind of follow-up question, which is, if there is belonging, then there must be an attendant unbelonging. Who in Canada really gatekeeps in your estimation, and how is that gatekeeping facilitated and encouraged?
Well, first of all, I'll answer the second part first. You know, gatekeeping is not something which is written out so that everybody, you could just go and buy a brochure and these are the rules and this is the perimeter fence and so on. That's like gatekeeping is much more insidious and invisible. You know, there's a lot of received opinions in any country. Canada likes to think of itself as a country that is very open in esprit when it's not as open as it thinks it is. Not by any means, and that they have all kinds of, they propagate all kinds of biases and so on in terms of you know, the rules of art. For a very long time, for example, Canada, you know, of course, you know, the whole idea of the multicultural project, which is an administrative project, by the way, of the official administrative project of the government, with the whole bureaucracy behind it to maintain multiculturalism, right? As a category, as an official category, was also a kind of political project to give some sense of definition to Canada, but to also ensure the governance of all the different colored people by the ruling elites of Canada, right? I wrote a whole essay on that. So there's gatekeeping, and for a very long time, the Canadian art world, and probably still is to a great extent, but for a very long time, you know, anyone who was non-white was basically at the margins of the art world, you know, in Canada. You know, you might be able to get a show at some artist-run space, but it was very, very hard to come in. And there was I remember I had a studio visit, you know, I like using anecdotes, and this was a very important curator at the time in Canada, and said to me, and like just hardly ever came to Vancouver, and said, oh, right, yeah, you're Asian, right? And I said, okay, does it matter? No, of course not, right? But then the fact that it was brought up, I'm going, well, why would you say that? The first thing you know, don't even say, oh, it's the first thing. And then later on, as she's looking at my work, she goes, oh, well, of course you're interested in that because you're Asian, right? And then I said, no, I was interested because something else. Right. And then later on, the opposite was also true. Right. Well, you know, given that you're Asian, I think you should push it in this direction. You know, so there's a lot of guidance given to me. And I'm sure I wasn't the only person of difference that felt things like that. There was a lot of things like that at that time. It's probably a lot better now. Right. But for a very long time, and I can't imagine how many artists of color, and especially, were basically pushed out at that time, you know, in all those years that stopped making art.
Right. I mean, when it's now a million years ago, but when I went to art school, I kind of assumed that the model that was related to me was true. You work as an artist. The curator picks up on what you do as an artist. The critic follows the curator. The commercial gallery follows the critic and the curator, and it goes like this. But sometimes I have this impression now that they all look to each other in some way. Like there's no actual.
Well, the art world's very social, right? But your first mistake was assuming that the art world is premised on a meritocracy,
right?
When it's not, right? I mean, to some degree it is, because if you had no criteria whatsoever in terms of making distinctions of value between something that's wretched and something that's more interesting, then there'd be nothing, right? But of course, even within that context, you have lots and lots of contradictions. You have lots. I mean, there are artists who are deemed incredibly important in today's contemporary art world, and you know, my opinion is I don't like the work at all. I don't. It's not that I don't get it. I don't think it's very good, right? But of course, no one would ever say that, right? So, right. But there is still there is a semblance of a system of valuation. It's not like it doesn't exist either. There is good art compared to bad art. There is some better artists and so on, right? And so, and I think but overall it's very messy, and you're right. But that messiness is part of any social order. I kind of like that messiness personally.
You do, okay. Okay. It terrifies me. I just feel like I have, you know, no solid ground that I stand on, and I don't actually understand how the consensus is built around something.
Right.
You know, yeah, I'm trying not to be dickish, you know.
Yeah, no, I think in the department where I teach, where I chair actually, we try to teach our students all the kind of practical, messy aspects of why the art world's messy and what you need to do to get ahead, right? We don't have rules. We can't kind of give them guiding principles, but we can give them a sense of the messiness and the sense of the contradictions, and some, you know, and a lot of personal anecdotal experience sessions and so on, so that they can learn how to negotiate this world, which is so, you know, odd.
Right. I reading a couple of passages from the book, it reminded me that early on, sort of about the time of 1990, 1991, something like that, I knew someone who went to grad school in New York from Canada. And she was relating to me that in her experience in New York, unlike in Canada, and precisely contrary to what would have been her expectation, you could really call pretty much any curator, any gallerist in New York, and they would fix a time to come and visit you. They'd get in a cab or get in the subway.
Yeah, that's the old art world. That's true. I would say by the end of the 70s, maybe the early part of the 80s, that was the end point for that. It's true, but it was true. There was a sense of a bohemia for which artists, curators, and so on felt that they were a kind of community. There were a set of artist bars, for example, in New York, where everyone would go. I remember as a young artist going to Chinese Chance, even though I'm Chinese, I went to Chinese Chance. It was a bar, and then there, you know, I met Baldessari, right? And then I also met a very young artist at that time, just recently arrived in New York, named Jenny Holzer, right? So I was able to meet all kinds of, I met Joseph Kossuth there. So I met these people and, you know, I had a drink with them, and it was, you know, and it wasn't even a big deal. It wasn't like somehow I'm going there up to the, you know, the wise person or something like that. It was just much more open. And nowadays it's not like that at all.
No, but and I think the thing that really comes out to me, I don't think we talked about artists and having an idea of an ecology at that time, but it seemed to me that it was really actually following that model.
No, I don't think that's true. I think people did speak about it as having, you know, this is the art world. It was much smaller. It was much more delineated, and it was even geographically circumscribed to a small part of the West Village, right? But now it's everywhere. You have, you know, and you have mega galleries, and they have 10 branch plants around different cities in the world, and of course it's a much more globalized situation with many artists from all parts of the world, right? And it's constantly changing. There's, you know, numerous art fairs and biennales and so on. The biennale is a good thing, I think, because you know, that's where you can actually find people who have something to say, you know, or first entering into the world of contemporary art from some distressed part of the world, and their voice is really important.
Yeah, but I guess maybe I'm wondering even just more locally why this real sense of an ecology doesn't really shape at least what I see or experience.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think there was you know, there was a sense that the art world was, like as I mentioned, a bohemia, right? And a kind of alternative, right? And that, of course, there's a romanticism to that goes back to Baudelaire and, you know, and so on, Manet and so on, you know, like the Salon de Réfugiés Artistes and so on. But I do think, you know, it's turned into really big business, to be honest. You know, I go up to New York like quite regularly, and even the small galleries are the size of the old Soho galleries, right? And the pressures in terms of the economy of the artist to produce work that fills a gallery space is immense these days.
Ken, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, told to watch the clock.
Maybe there's, I don't know, the audience has questions, right?
Should we turn it over to the audience? Or?
just in case, but I don't see any up there. So you just continue.
I was wondering if you could summarize briefly some of the differences that you have to account for as an artist doing public art as opposed to your studio practice.
Well, I mean, public art is different because public art, you don't have the advantage of an audience that knows it's art that they're engaging in and experiencing, right? And so public art, you have to account for all the people who have no idea of what art is, and nor should they have to know what art is. And so that makes it different. Public art, you also have to deal with all these narratives that are floating, as almost like floating signifiers in whatever geography the work is to be cited. You have to have some sense of the kind of community histories and local histories and even geological histories of a site. And then public art is like it's like Desserteau's famous axiom about, space is practiced place. You have to convert a place from being geographical coordinates into to space. Space is space that demands the interpolation of people, right? That people, their responses to the work, the dialogue that's sparked by the work produces a kind of discursive space, like in an Henri Lefebvre sense. And so that's a very different demand than from gallery art. So I like gallery art. I'm tired of doing public art. I want to go back to making gallery art, right? But public art is interesting. But the downside of public art is also it's highly administered, right? So it's like it's an extension of developers' rights, and they have way too much say in terms of the processes, or it's a function of the creative economy department of City Hall.
Right. I think one of the points for me is the troubling points for me is the permanent public art commission. The fact that it's permanent is the thing that kind of troubles me. I'm sort of bothered by this idea of artists being parachuted into a community that's they don't really have any actual engagement with.
There's a lot. I mean, there are a lot of professional public art artists, right? I mean, I'm not going to be so rude to say they're not artists, but they're professionals and they just live in a client mentality. They want to satisfy the client, right? I'm not that type of artist. I don't want to satisfy the client. I don't see the client as a client. I see the work of art as trying to produce critical space and for dialogue or whatever. And that maybe even willing to open up difficult questions about something, right? I'm not interested in just doing something ornamental and pretty for client's sake. But there's a lot of professional public art artists that have no problems with that, and of course the system of public art management, by and large, caters to that type of artist. So sometimes I'm invited to be shortlisted in all kinds of projects, and I just go, I'm not interested, because I can tell they're just going to want something that maybe it has some appeal to the public because it's fun, it's interactive, it's chromatically interesting, but it's not interesting as a work of art.
We have this. We have a 1% law in Quebec.
That 1% rule started in Philadelphia, by the way.
Oh, is that right? Okay, I didn't know.
The first 1% rule for art.
Okay. I mean,
but I also think that why should each property developer get their 1% just because they pay 1%? Why can't you accumulate the 1% to be spent on some place in need or whatever? Why does it have to be a public art for each of the properties? It's totally stupid.
Right. I really I find a lot of it results in just these kinds of variations of nonsensical and really non-committal theme. It's kind of like this and like that, and it's supposed to change.
Plop art.
Yeah,
they call it plop art.
Plop art. Yeah, right. There's no way to address the underlying social and economic conditions that make some people have to sleep under that monument.
Yeah.
And there's no way to do it because the committees demand an object, and they demand to know what kind of an object.
Well, that calls up the great opening scene of City Lights by Charlie Chaplin, where it opens up with the monument being unveiled, and when and all the mayor's there and all these fancy rich people are there, and then when they unveil the monument, Charlie Chaplin, the tramp, is sleeping on the monument. So if you don't know it, it's worth seeing.
Chloe, how are we doing on time?
Sorry, I had to move around to unmute myself. We are almost 8:30. You know, maybe we want to wrap it up pretty soon.
Okay.
Did you have other prepared questions for?
Oh, I mean, I had a bunch.
I mean, it's really awesome listening to you guys talk. I'm just like thrilled, but I also kind of want to be a bit mindful of everybody's time.
Right. Just because people haven't typed questions in, does it mean that they don't have them, or?
Audience, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box. But yeah, it seems like people don't have any.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's usual.
Oh, we do have a question.
You have a couple.
But Trevor, Ken, could you speak a bit of any writers in particular who are models for you?
Who are models for me? You mean in terms of my drawing? They take off their clothes and they model. Any writers? No, in terms of the classic ones, I've always, in terms of, let's just say, philosophers, I've always liked, you know, Foucault, Roger Chartier. He's not classic, but he's more contemporary. Roger Chartier, Derrida, and they still continually shape so much of how I think about art. Another is like Giorgio Agamben, a great Italian writer of contemporariness, about the kind of apperception of the individual, the problems of an individual that perceives things or feels things more sharply. And I've always kind of had that kind of romantic view of an artist that, as someone who feels things more sharply, and that's why they want to be in art, right? Of course, not every artist is like that, but that's my one of my ideals of art. So I like writers like that. And in the past year or so, I've been reading a lot of books on, and maybe this sounds almost like Alex Haley, you know, finding my own roots. But I read a lot of books on the history of chattel labor, contract labor in America, right? And during this period of comparative racism, especially after the conclusion of the Civil War in 1864. And so that period all the way up until 1910 and so on, I did a deep dive, read a lot of books on the Chinese body in New York City, for example, the location of chop suey. I read a book on the location of chop suey houses through Manhattan, why they're located there. It turned out they were very close to subway stations so that the workers could get back quickly as possible to Chinatown and things like that. So I've been reading a lot of books like that. So yeah, and of course I should read more novels. I haven't read a lot of novels. I like to read Adam Hochschild a lot, because he writes a lot of books about made dramatic moments in history. So I tend to read those types of books if I'm given the choice between that and a fiction book. So maybe that's what's wrong with me. I need to read some fiction. I don't read so much. I used to read quite a lot of fiction, but they were always historical, like Turgenev and Gogol and Dostoevsky and things like that. But I haven't read a lot of historical or contemporary fiction.
Well,
I have one. If there is no one else, I have one. Ken, people are especially since this pandemic descended on us, there are young artists, there are even artists my age, artists older who are struggling. What is the thing that you can think to tell them to keep them hanging on, keep going?
Je dirais à un jeune artiste intéressé par l'art aujourd'hui de savoir qu'être un artiste qui est un voyage de toute une vie. C'est vraiment un voyage toute une vie. Et préparez-vous à un parcours difficile, c'est pas simple, pas du tout. Et soyez stimulés par l'insatisfaction du monde et améliorez-le si vous le pouvez, notamment grâce à ce que l'art peut vous apporter. So, I hope you can understand my accent. I was just saying that to someone young, and you know, it's like art's a long game. It's a lifetime trajectory, and so prepare yourself because it's not easy. And then forget what else I said. It's like you know, always be stimulated, always be curious, and let the dissatisfaction of the world drive you, and to seek to improve it through the power of that's possible, I still believe, through art. So I have to translate that because I'm afraid that people might go, oh my God, what did he just say earlier?
It's clear to me.
Non, ça fait quelque temps que je parle français, c'est difficile de, you know, je suis très rouillé. Okay.
Well, for me, it is wasn't obvious to do this. I'm an artist. I'm not a journalist or an art historian or a curator. I really live with the caca in my head sort of every day, and don't necessarily look beyond it. And when Chloe proposed this to me, should it have been another artist, I probably would have, I hope, politely declined. But because it was you, and because you were really honestly, Ken, one of my earliest art heroes, and continue to this day to be an inspiration and a source of instruction on for someone like me. I had to do something about it. I hope I was just at least mildly competent. But anyway, I thank you tremendously for that. And I thank you for this book, which really, for me, told me to keep going forward towards things. I think it's like one of the central threads, whether it's directly or indirectly that you say it. It's like you have to keep changing your positions. You have to keep looking at things from outside your own comfortable frame of reference, and or the one that you think is the right one, and actually to open yourself to the world and to keep going towards it instead of receding away.
I appreciate that.
I really thank you very much for that.
Well, everybody.
I just said super français. Okay.
C'est vraiment bien.
Being very generous.
I want to thank you so much, Ken. You know, when I got this job, I figured that I might as well cold call some people and aim big, and it's been mind-blowing that all of these shots I tried for people that I really admire all said yes. And it's been such a pleasure to hear you read, and to listen to the conversation with Milutin. His questions have been really interesting. And yeah, like I'm just so glad that you agreed to do this with our super small organization.
Well, the reason why I had to accept was because, you know, in Chinese culture, the clan, C-A-L-A-N, not K-L-A-N, but the clan is very, very important, right? And so when I got an email from a Lum, I thought, well, I better accept, you know, I can't turn down another member of the clan.
Well, I'm glad that it worked to my advantage then. But yeah, I just want to thank you so much for this amazing conversation and reading, and to thank all of the members of the audience who've been here volume has a whole series of Zoom talks and real life events going on that are all available on our website. Tomorrow night, we have Moira Davey, who will be reading from her 2 recent books, and then have a conversation with the artist and writer Medusa Larivière. And Friday on Zoom, we have from Los Angeles, we have Harry Dodge, who'll be reading from his latest book. So please, if you're interested in the other events or the fair itself, please check out what we have going on. It's a really packed couple of days, and then there's programming all October. Thanks again so much to Ken and to Milutin. It's been a real pleasure to get to be part of this. It's been real.
Okay, thanks a lot, everybody.
All right, have a good.
All right, au revoir. Bonne nuit. Okay. Thanks.
Talk to you.